Welcome, everyone. My name is Nicole Taylor, and I'm privileged to serve as Pepperdine University's Chief Business Officer. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is our inaugural Real Issues, Real Experts, real-time event, and this is part of a new series where Pepperdine will engage in conversations with subject matter experts about timely issues as those matters unfold. This is one of the many initiatives that President Gash has introduced that promote diversity of thought, deep dialogue, and mutual understanding among the Pepperdine community. And as a place of higher learning, we are creating an environment of civil discourse that's critical to the advancement of Pepperdine's mission of preparing students for lives of purpose, service, and leadership. And through this format, we look forward to welcoming friends from all over the world to explore important topics together. Jim Gash, Pepperdine's 8th president, will lead tonight's discussion about a current national conversation you are no doubt familiar with. President Gash will be joined by 3 national and cybersecurity experts who will discuss the mysterious Chinese surveillance balloon that was spotted in our skies and subsequently shot down by U.S. fighter jets on February 5th. The panel discussion will be followed by a question and answer session. And if you have a question during the discussion, you can enter that question in the chat feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And with that, we welcome President Gash. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you all for joining us this evening. As Nicole said, this is our inaugural episode in this series, and we've got a fun one ahead of us. So before we begin, I'm going to introduce who the participants are. We would take up the entire 60 minutes if I gave their full introduction, so I'm just going to hit the highlights. First, we have Kristen Edwards Marquardt. She brings extensive global experience in leading, guiding, and advising organizations in the area of national security, risk, cybersecurity, and global information security. Marquardt currently leads the North American digital and cyber practice at Teichert, a global strategy advisory firm supporting corporations and investors on the opportunities and risks facing their businesses. Previously, she served as the intelligence advisor to the Secretary of Homeland Security, as a senior professional staffer on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and as an intelligence officer at the CIA. She's a graduate of BYU and the University of Utah. Second is General John Teichert, a recently retired brigadier general, a national security expert, and a champion for inspirational, innovative, integrity-filled leadership. General Teichert retired as the Assistant Deputy Undersecretary of the Air Force for International Affairs, where he was responsible for worldwide international engagement on behalf of the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Space Force while leading the service's entire security cooperation portfolio. Prior to that, General Teichert was the senior defense official and defense attaché to Iraq, leading on the front lines of the whole of government national security strategy and policy in the most challenging of circumstances. He's been a F-15E combat pilot and an F-22 test pilot, and has commanded Joint Base Andrews and Edwards Air Force Base. He's a graduate of MIT and Stanford. And third, Josh Steinman is the co-founder of Galvanic, a cloud-native analysis platform that helps companies secure their industrial operations and minimize cyber risk. For 4 years, he served on the National Security Council as Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for Cybersecurity. Josh is a military veteran who served in the U.S. Navy as an officer for nearly a decade and later as a reserve officer. He holds degrees from the University of Chicago and Georgetown University. Welcome to all 3 of you panelists. Glad you're here. Okay, we're going to get started with a hypothetical question. I'm a former law professor, so we're starting with a hypo. All 3 of you have been advisors to our government at the highest levels. Assume you received a phone call on January 28th saying, "We need your input." Who would it be coming from? We'll start with you, John. Who would it be coming from, and who would have been in that conversation prior to you getting the call about what is this thing? What do we know about it?
No, so President Gash, thank you so much for having me and having us here on this great topic. At least from my perspective, I would be very interested to hear what the Northern Command commander is saying about this. There's a lot of different avenues that would ultimately get to the National Security Council, but the single entity that is responsible for homeland defense from a military perspective is the Northern Command commander. And I would immediately want to know, is this ours? And if not, where did it come from and what do we know about it? That's where I would start.
Okay. And so when you hear it's a 200-foot tall balloon that's carrying a payload the size of 2 or 3 school buses, what's going to be your first instinct as to what this is and whose this is? We'll keep with you, John, for the moment.
Yeah, so absolutely. I would likely know in this case that it was not ours and it did not originate from the United States. And so based on the best interest of our national security, I would very quickly wonder, what is that payload and what are the courses of action that we should consider to protect our homeland from this unknown violation of our national sovereignty?
Okay. Thank you, John. So Kristen, you're now working, we're putting you back into the Homeland Security office and you're advising the Secretary of Homeland Security. What would have been the chain of command before it reached you? Who would have had what conversations with whom about this before you were asked, what's your advice?
Well, most of the information would be coming in from other partners in the interagency. As John said, we would have been looking to the military to provide insight into when it reached our airspace, what kind of information they were able to ascertain about it. Josh would have gotten, the White House would have gotten a lot of information pouring in there, and that they would have been at the center of trying to determine, what do we know, what do we not know. Once it was determined that it's not a military threat, then there's an entirely other conversation that begins to take place. But those first frantic hours are really going to be around, what's the danger to the American people and to the homeland, more so than even knowing where did it come from. But that's part of the conversation, right? Because intent is behind every action.
Excellent. Thank you. Josh, you're working for the president as you were in the prior administration, and you get this call in the middle of the night saying, hey, we've got a situation. What's the chain of command that would have led to you getting that call?
Thanks, Jim. Great to be here, and really great to be on this panel with 2 other really accomplished individuals. So the way this would have, and probably still does, go down is that there are watch floors around the world. As the general alluded to, there's probably one at US Northcom, there's one at the Pentagon. And so Northcom would have been tracking this thing for some period of time, feeding that information back to the Pentagon's watch floor. And then what they would have done is called the White House Situation Room to let the National Security Council know. And they would have called the relevant staffer. If it, in the previous administration, had been a cyber issue, they would have called me. They would have called probably the defense senior director in this case. And the question at that point is going to be like, what information do we know? How much time is going to, could elapse before we know an increment of more information? And then the question to that senior director is going to be, do we wake up the national security advisor? And then ultimately, do we wake up the president? And unfortunately, more often than not, it often is a question of news cycles. And so depending on the time of day that you get that phone call, it can mean that maybe you have some time before something's going to hit the news, or maybe not. And so if it's during the workday, usually what happens is you want to go right over the West Wing, because the NSC actually sits across the street in this building called the Executive Office Building. And so during the day, you essentially have to go right over, and you get everybody on the phone and you develop like an immediate action plan for press engagement, et cetera. If it's during the night, sometimes you have a little bit of time. And usually all that is essentially pinging, as Kristen has identified, the various folks in the departments and agencies, and just saying, hey, look, by 4:30, 5 a.m., we need to know your best estimate of what's happening here, because we're going to round up like a one-pager. We're going to walk into White House morning staff meeting at 6 a.m. and we're going to say, hey, here's what's going on. And we have to build a plan of the day at that point. Because as we saw, essentially like CNN gets a hold of the story and then the day's gone.
All right. So John, back to you. So your first reaction, let's say you're called, and I know there's going to be a lot of other people in that room, but your first reaction is, okay, we've got something that's probably not ours. And you probably ascertain pretty quickly whether it is yours. But what will formulate this? Okay, John, what do you think? What should we do? Should we take action now? Should we wait? Walk us through your thought process as you evaluate what the next steps that we should take, or that you would advise that we take in face of this object in our territorial skies?
No, so President Gash, I would start developing a list of COAs, courses of action, and those would be informed by the benefits of doing something and the costs of doing something and the risks of doing something or not doing something. And then I would look through based on those COAs that I put together and come up with a recommendation that properly looks at, again, costs, benefits, and risks, not just in the immediate term, but also the second and third order effects with respect to our relationship with whoever the source country was that launched that balloon. And I would, of course, infuse all of that with an understanding of the history of balloon programs and what we know about those programs. And all of that should be informed, as the other two experts on the panel said, by an interagency process that has the best sources of information to source out those costs, benefits, and risks to be able to forward the best recommended COA for those decision makers going forward.
Okay, excellent. Let's go back to you, Josh, and say, and the question is, what would we possibly learn by waiting? What would we possibly risk by waiting? Same question to you, Kristen, after Josh. What are the risks of acting by taking it out? It's like, what would that, you're now at this NSC meeting and you're sitting around a table and people have said their piece, and now it's Josh. We're like, we got to decide, or the president has to decide whether we're going to shoot this down or not. You're advising the president. What are the pros and cons of waiting and not waiting?
Yeah, Jim, it's a great question. Let me just frame that a little bit more, because I think the context is going to be really important here for folks to understand at home, which is that, okay, so we had that memo go out, or that notice go out overnight saying, hey, get your best recommendations in by 6 a.m. By 7:30, there's probably an all hands National Security Council meeting. That's with the president and the heads of the various departments and agencies, CIA, state, DOD, DOE, energy, and various others, probably Interior, Homeland Security, definitely in this scenario. And so what's going on is now it's 7:30, 7:45 in the morning. Tensions are probably going, running high. And so that list of COAs that, as John identified, had probably been developed overnight, saying, hey, we have 3 or 4 courses of action, is now by 7:45 in the morning, literally being briefed to the president. And maybe that list of COAs that came out from Northcom was modified by some NSC staffer. Maybe they said, I don't think COA 3 might be quite right. Or maybe there's a State Department angle on COA 2. But the point is that at that meeting, again, we're 7:45, 8 a.m. in the morning. At that meeting, all these decisions are getting made. And so I think the thing that people don't often take into account is that you essentially have to leave that meeting with a plan that you're going to be able to then brief to the entire public. And so while I think a lot of people like to sort of Monday morning quarterback these types of decisions and say, well, they should have done X, should have done Y, should have done Z. In many cases, it is that public engagement piece that folks in the White House are paying a lot of attention to. And present in that National Security Council meeting is going to be the head of White House comms and possibly the spokesperson, maybe not, depending on clearance issues. And so it's a really important piece to understand that a lot of people want to make sure that the president seems to remain in control of the scenario.
Okay. And so Elizabeth, Kristen, what are we risking in your estimation by not shooting it down, and what do we gain by not shooting it down? Like, are we learning more?
Yeah, absolutely. As time unfolds, you'll be able to get more information as you get eyes on it from a variety of levels. You're also going to be able to get more information. I mean, one of the things that's contextual here, as Josh was saying, is going to be really important is, where is it? What's it over? Because there's a difference between making a decision to, as you said, shoot something down that's over farmland or the ocean or a lake, as opposed to a metropolitan area, or even an area that has not intense development, but some. So there's a lot of choices that come into play. So what's the context? What's going on around it? From a DHS perspective, as Josh was saying, you need a plan to brief the public. there's a lot of local, state and local coordination that's going to be pushed out through the various organs that the Homeland Security has with state and local authorities. So that's going to be another portion of this. How do you prep people who are in the area? How do you ensure information flow is going? And it's different kinds of information at different levels. Again, clearance is going to be part of it, but it's not going to stop the fact that you're going to want people who are in the area to be able to have as much information as possible at that time. At the same time, you're trying to get as much information as you can get from all sorts of sources, right? And so if you wait, it's the opportunity to have more information, to understand whether or not there's going to be a better place to make possibly kinetic choices, right? But it comes with the risk of, have you ascertained yet? Is it a physical threat, right? So, I mean, one of the big decision points would have been when they're able to actually say, you know what, there's no payload on top of this thing. It's not going to harm anybody. It's comms equipment, it's surveillance equipment. Okay, different stress level comes down, different set of scenarios is put on the table, and choices get made that way, right?
And how much does it matter, staying with you, Kristen, how much does it matter what they're over? So the early press reports were, well, they're hovering over missile silo sites in Montana. Is that part of it as well? Or do we feel like, no, they're not going to get anything from a balloon above Montana? Or is that like, well, geez, they're hovering over someplace we don't want them there, we need to take it out?
Yeah. Yeah, I think part of it is they're hovering over something we really don't want them hovering over, right? However, there's a lot of things hovering over those things from space. There are different things that you're going to be able to understand and collect, and John probably can speak to this really well, as opposed to what you're going to get from a satellite that's 300 miles above the Earth, and where you're going to get from something that's 30,000 feet above the Earth, right? So it's a little bit different. Also, balloons lower, slower, so they get to hover, as you said, over a place a little bit longer. So what it's over, if it's a sensitive site, that's one conversation. If it's over a population center, that's another conversation, right? Both in terms of what are they getting, but also what can you do about it at that moment?
Excellent, excellent, very insightful. John, balloons. You fly fighter jets and they're floating a balloon. Tell us about like why. Kristen alluded to they're lower and slower. Like, did you encounter balloons as you're flying your jet? And were we aware that there was a balloon program with China? Tell us more about why a balloon.
Yeah, so absolutely. And if you go back all the way, at least as early as the Civil War, balloons were being used in warfare. And they were being used in warfare then as observation posts to be able to see what was going on the ground. And essentially, the benefits today are very similar. If you think about a constellation of satellites and wanting to have a redundant capability to replace satellites, say in a conflict that were taken out, you could use a constellation of balloons to surveil the Earth, or as communication relays or nodes, or even a navigation system like a GPS. And there are some unmanned fixed wing aircraft that are being developed that can fly solar powered at very high altitudes that can do a similar type of thing. And like Kristen was saying, there are some benefits in the fidelity of what you're able to gather as you're closer to the target. Instead of the 300 or 200 mile up satellite that's in low Earth orbit, now you're at 60,000 feet, and it provides more fidelity. But like she also said, because you're able to go slower, then not only can you gather data over a site for longer, but you can also start to collect pattern of life. Instead of being a satellite that whizzes around the Earth in 120 minutes, you can sit there and gather intel of various sorts over time to understand not just a snapshot of what's going on, but a duration of what's going on. And that can be very telling in your understanding of an adversary. And so there's a lot of benefits to balloons. And I think they're gaining a bit of a resurgence, not just because of what we've been talking about in the last 2 weeks, but an understanding of the benefits of the redundancy of balloons to back up satellites that are fairly juicy targets for an adversary in a conflict.
Excellent.
And if I can add, I had the opportunity to serve in Afghanistan, and we definitely use surveillance balloons for force protection because they allowed you to have a really high perch, have a 360 view, and be able to to see when people wanted to spend time with you and when you didn't want them to spend time with you.
It's a good way to put it. I also liked your, whether we'd have a kinetic response. I think that means shoot something down. Is that right?
Yeah. It's action oriented.
I'm learning the lingo. Josh, data transfer from the payload. It looks like was something that was a surveillance equipment that was transmitting data. What do we think we know? What do we know, and what do we think we know about that? And was there a risk of letting it continue to go across the country transmitting data? And could we stop that? Short of a kinetic response, could we shut down the data transmission? And if so, what does that look like?
It's a great question, Jim. I think it's one that people ought to be asking. Obviously, the limits of my knowledge are going to have to be a little fuzzy here because of legal obligations that I have holding a clearance. But what I can just say is, obviously, with something at that size and at that distance, there's a lot of things that you can do. And I've seen some traffic on Twitter talking about running things like ground penetrating radar that can map out in depth facilities such as missile silos. There is very likely a suite of things available at that height that you can do in the SIGINT realm, definitely in the imagery realm. And the persistence offers you, a lot of opportunity to do that. And so I think that having something of that size in that location at that speed, there's just a lot of opportunity there. And what's going to happen right now is we've probably got people breaking that thing down, trying to understand what it was designed to do. But think of it from our perspective, which is that if you gave me a balloon with, the parameters that I think we can sort of backwards interpret, there's a lot of stuff that I would want to put on that platform and collect, abroad.
Okay. Well, I'll just have to guess what those are, because I can't ask you national security secrets. Well, John, we've talked about a kinetic response. We've talked about the payload on there. They're looking at it now in gathering what's there. You flew one of these planes that shot it down. You've launched these missiles. Tell us about what it's like. Like you're up in the air, you're given the order, take down a balloon, pop a balloon. Hey, John, kinetic response on a balloon. Can you just pop the balloon, or how does the missile know what to hit? And does the fact that it's not a jet engine with a big heat signal make it harder to hit? And didn't we just blow it up? Like, how does this work?
No, so that's a great question. And that fighter pilot in that squadron at Langley Air Force Base that was given that tasker would first ask, what is the requirement? And part of the requirement is that we want to bring this thing down, but we want to bring it down with as much of the payload remaining as possible so that we can exploit it, as Josh was saying. And so you would start thinking through, how do I meet that requirement with the weapons that I have? And you would think through based on a couple of different types of missiles that those airplanes carry. And you would also think through the use of bullets, 20-millimeter bullets that are carried by an F-22, and whether that mix of capability would meet the requirements. And I think they certainly talked to some contractor experts that know a bit about balloons and they know a bit about weaponeering. And they talked to Raytheon, who makes the AIM-9X. And this was not a particular test point that I ever flew in the F-22 at Edwards Air Force Base. But there is some history with respect to trying to shoot down balloons with bullets and it not working, especially at high altitude. And so I think they probably thought through that as an opportunity and then discounted it based on some historical data and came to the conclusion that that balloon would have enough of a contrast in the infrared spectrum with the background that you could get a missile to lock on the balloon. And the good thing about an F-22 that's up there at 60,000 feet that can go as high as the balloon was and other aircraft that can't, is that you can see if that missile is locked on before you launch it, and then you know that it's going to get a hit. I don't know if they actually launched an AIM-9X that had a warhead or not. There's a little bit of debate about that, open source. But one of the things they could have done is puncture the balloon with a missile that doesn't blow up to preserve as much of the payload as possible as they They go down and dig it out of the mud off the coast of South Carolina. But you would start with the requirement and go through the weaponeering options, and then you would be the lucky guy or gal that gets to shoot it down. And to some extent, you'd be fairly proud of being able to do so and get the first air-to-air kill for an F-22. But you're probably getting a new call sign out of that engagement as well. And I would vote for Hindenburg.
Hindenburg, okay. Balloon boy or balloon girl, maybe something like that. Do you think we'll ever know? Do you think the world will ever know who the pilot was that shot it down?
I think it will come out. There's a sense of pride of being that person. But yeah, I think they'll probably get a new call sign out of it as well.
Okay, fantastic. So Josh, being a former Navy guy, we shot it down in water. You know, I think 70 to 100 feet of water. We've now seen images of them pulling the balloon into a boat. What does it look like? What is an operation like that? A retrieval, recovery? You probably have a cooler name for that than I can come up with. But salvage operation. What does that look like, and what do we expect to be gaining from that, and how will we go about deconstructing what's there?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jim. So the Navy has units that are called mobile MUDSU, mobile diving and salvage units. I believe, and again, my information's some years old. I got it over a decade ago, but I believe there are both East and West Coast ones. So likely the East Coast teams would have been tasked to do this. And yeah, I think 70 feet is well within the capabilities of the US Navy and the Joint Force to extract something like this off the bottom of the ocean. Obviously, you have to go find out where it is and then go get it. Nothing as complex as the Glomar Explorer operation, which I would turn to my good colleague here to talk about in depth. Would we wish to discuss that?
Okay, and which colleague were you referring to?
Kristen.
Kristen, care to elaborate on?
She can neither confirm nor deny it, I think is the joke.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I won't go. You could tell us who you have to kill us. We will not go there. That's too right.
Yeah.
Say again.
Off the bottom of the ocean. It's a famous story. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Well, as a former torts professor, and I've confessed that earlier, let me educate as well as ask another question about how do we know when we can shoot this down? When there were no such thing as air flight, the assumption was if you owned a piece of property, you owned the dirt on top of the land, and you owned everything under your land to the center of the earth. You also owned all of the airspace above your land up until the reaches of the heavens. Now, obviously, it doesn't work now with air flight. You can't just say, I'm suing United for trespassing by flying 40,000 feet above. But at some point, there is a height or depth that is, in fact, a trespass. Like, you can't come over our property. John, we don't shoot down other countries' satellites. They don't shoot down our satellites, even though we're invading their airspace, if you use that common law definition, even though they're invading ours. How high is too high? How high is high enough that we wouldn't in our military act?
So President Gash, there was a treaty signed in 1967 that said that there can be no sovereign claims to anything in space. And that is not defined as far as altitude. I think in people's minds, it is when the predominant physical forces on an object are orbital forces, not aerodynamic forces. But there is a large range of air or space where you're a little bit in limbo. If low Earth orbit drops down maybe as low as 150 miles, and that's as low as a satellite can orbit in a sustainable fashion. And if the highest typical planes are going no higher than 50 or 60,000 feet, then there's a lot of space between 12 miles high and 150 miles high, where you don't really know if there is a sovereignty claim in that space. It has never been defined, There have been some forays into making that definition. But right now, I think the prevailing definition is one of orbital mechanics that is as low as 150 miles, and anything below that, you can claim sovereignty to.
Hey, Jim, do you mind if President
Please
Gash,
jump
mind if
in. Absolutely.
So just to sort of put the hat back on of National Security Council staffer, I think the point that John makes is a really important one, which is that the dynamics of the conversation playing out the morning of this event, or whenever this event happens, probably pull in experts like John or other folks from the Air Force, flag officers, senior executives, because in many cases, and this does happen a lot, the discussion is going to also pivot around what a United States response will imply, not just for the immediate activity at hand, but future activity. And so there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not there are similar US programs or if other people have used balloons, et cetera. And what is the convention? John referred to the treaties of navigation in outer space. There are other treaties that have been signed with other nations around free navigation. And the question likely that came up in that Situation Room meeting, again, I have no insight into whether or not it did, but you have to imagine that the Secretary of State is going to say, okay, we can make this decision, and this goes back to the COAs that John was talking about. We can make this decision to shoot this thing down, but now we have to understand that at every point in the future, if we ever choose to fly a balloon over someone else's territory, that they're going to have this, diplomatic claim on, hey, the Americans did it, so we can too.
Okay.
And maybe just another parlay, if you don't mind, President Gash. President Biden today, when he talked about the way forward, talked about 4 steps, and the last one was working with the global community to establish a new set of norms with respect to balloon activity. And I think that's important because there's a lot of undefined space. And like Josh said, we did set a precedent by what we did 2 weeks ago. And now we need to help the global community to understand, or lead them in understanding, what the right norm should be with respect to activities going forward.
Okay, excellent stuff. Let's talk about what's happened since then. We've had now some shoot downs of some smaller objects, or presumably smaller objects, that we weren't shooting down before, which of course brings in the point that both Josh, you and John just made about, okay, well, that has now just set precedent. The US has demonstrated it will shoot down objects that it doesn't recognize over its territory once it assesses, presumably, the safety of what's happening there. We were just told by President Biden today in a press conference that those objects were not related to the first Chinese spy balloon, I guess we'll call it. We'll just call it a Chinese balloon. They're still claiming it's not a spy balloon, but what now? Do we have, to your knowledge, Kristen, do we, you mentioned that we had balloons that we were flying over Afghanistan in wars. Do we expect those to be shot down? And do we think that we have balloons aloft right now?
So in Afghanistan, they were stationary balloons for force protection, flown with the permission of the Afghan government. So I think it's a slightly different conversation to be had there. And people definitely did shoot at them because they had eyes on the people who were trying to form NATO forces. And so as a result, I think some of those issues apply here, but some of them don't. So as far as these, the 3 additional objects that have been shot down, and it's not just the US standing alone and setting precedents here. One was taken down over Canada with their authorities and at their direction. And so that is a wider conversation for a precedent between 2 very close allies in a very defined hemispheric space. But it is a little bit of a wider conversation that I think is interesting here. It'll be really, it's going to be part of that international dialogue that President Biden referred to, wanting to set norms that are going to be useful, both mostly in civilian applications over not over war zones, right? So those are kind of two different spheres with definitely different rules of engagement and different expectations. As far as a further discussion of who owns those objects and what they were doing, it's been harder to recover the wreckage from those because one's in incredibly deep water, kind of the opposite of where the Chinese spy balloon went down, which is in less than 70 feet of water, which is, as Josh said, a completely accessible place. One's over deep water. Another one is just very difficult to get to because of weather conditions in the far north. So it's going to be really interesting once folks have those to really start to examine them and to ask questions as what was their purpose, who's behind it, and if it was a commercial application that was being researched, someone's going to have a really, really bad day explaining to the federal government why they were not declaring them or having a coming forward when they were falling out of the sky. And if they weren't, that's going to be another conversation, both diplomatically and militarily.
Thanks, Kristen, for illuminating that a bit more. We seem to now have gone back and looked and said, oh, actually, there were Chinese balloons over the US previously. We didn't see them in real time. Is there some sort of now calibration or recalibration of our surveillance technology that is allowing us to see these smaller balloons that we're now shooting down that we wouldn't have seen before? Like, have we essentially turned a big telescope into a microscope, looking at things more? I mean, John, what are you hearing about that, or what's your sense of that?
No, so absolutely. The Northern Command commander came out very quickly after the original incident and said that there are gaps in our domain awareness, which basically means we don't quite have the full grasp on what's flying over our country as maybe somebody would expect. And largely that's because we have tuned our sensors to be able to see things like inbound missiles and inbound fast-moving aircraft, and not slower-moving aircraft or slower-moving objects and things that maybe have a lower radar cross signature as they are also slow. And so I think that's just a matter of retuning or recalibrating our sensors. But like you suggested, there is a downside in doing so, and that is that now you likely are creating an option or opportunity for false positives, because now you're going to see things. We actually literally on a radar screen, when you get a false object that pops up, you call it a bird. It actually might physically be a bird, or it might just be an artifact of your radar being a little too sensitive at that moment. So you might get some false positives, or you might now take longer to perform the full scan of the domain because you're looking for the slower, smaller objects than you were before. And so there is a downside of the retuning, but I think General Van Herk and Northern Command are accurate in their belief that we need domain awareness, and we either are going to get that using the sensors we have now and retuning them, or getting more sensors so that we've got a more complete, thorough coverage of the domain.
Thanks for that. Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, just to sort of jump in, I do want to point out that there is a real important constitutional issue here, which is that there are reports that various elements of the military had tracked these entities, both this individual situation that we're talking about, and then previous ones. And I would just point out that the question then becomes, why wasn't the chain of command notified in those previous scenarios? Because you have a foreign object, possibly at the direction of a foreign government, possibly at the direction of a hostile foreign government, launching an object over the continental United States. And I think there needs to be some conversation about, if that was concealed from the chain of command, why that happened. Mm-hmm. The second point I would just make is that, as John identified, there's a huge data management problem here. And I would just offer that it's an interesting opportunity for the application of a lot of emerging technologies, which can very quickly filter through large amounts of information. Because as John was describing, many of these operations today are performed by human beings. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't be, just that it offers an opportunity for what we would call human machine teaming around big data sets.
So artificial intelligence, if I'm hearing you correctly?
As a startup entrepreneur, I don't like to use that phrase, just because often it leads to people saying, oh, you're waving hands, et cetera. But yeah, something on that order of magnitude. There are a bunch of companies out there that work on these types of problems, and they end up being, maybe something less than what folks would say is artificial intelligence, but sure, yeah, you could use that catchphrase.
So you're not referring to we should unleash Chat GPT on this situation?
Oh,
Not unless you wanted it to talk at it.
Okay, yeah, we don't want to talk at it, but we're shooting at these things. Does this, Kristen, this recalibration, this focusing more, does it potentially risk leisure hot air balloons getting shot down? Does it risk smaller planes being shot down, hang gliders being? I mean, I'm being maybe a little bit facetious, or am I?
I don't think the concern is about shooting them down right away, but it is going to expend an enormous amount of resources determining that these things are not threatening. Balloon festivals would take on a much higher insurance cost, I would think, because it's going to require a much larger amount of state, local, and federal coordination as a result. So it's a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of paperwork that is the offshoot of that, but it can be safely done. But it is also an enormous commitment, and Josh was talking about this. And John as well, if humans are having to sift through and make choices about what's good, what's bad, what's dangerous, what's safe, you're going to want to close the aperture a little bit, right? And not looking at millions of events, potential events. You're going to want to take it down, but that's still an enormous manpower commitment. And that's part of the reason that our radar sensitivities have not been so low, because that's an enormous commitment. And also because historically the threat has been, as John said, ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, which move very fast, or fighter planes, or commercial planes, right? But things that move fast at a higher altitude. And so now we're having a different conversation. We're opening up the aperture, and it's going to require human resources and coordination in order to be able to take care of these things safely.
Okay, well, excellent. Let's camp out on one more topic before we go to some audience questions. In the last few days, we have seen both houses of Congress pass resolutions condemning the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, for this incident. Let's talk about what implications both the balloon incident and this resolution condemning the Chinese Communist Party, what will that have on U.S.-China relations, and where are we going to go from here? We'll start with you, Kristen, and then just have a conversation among the three of you about that.
Well, what I think is really interesting here is part of the fact that Secretary Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State, was expected to travel to China. This first part of 2023 was kind of framed as an opportunity to de-escalate the tensions between the two countries, which are very political, because we actually have historic trade highs right now between our two countries. So it's not the economic piece, although we are pulling back in some strategic areas, some of the sensitive technologies that Josh touched on earlier, in terms of trading in those areas. But the economic relationship continues to evolve. But politically, it's gotten very tense, right? And so Secretary Blinken was expected to travel, and then the spy balloon arriving over the continental United States canceled that and has made it a lot more difficult. I think another thing that was really interesting is it took 2.5 days for the Chinese government to make any sort of coherent statement. And it really felt like they didn't have their ducks in an order. There was no communication or plan for what they would do or what they would say if things went awry. And so I think that's a really interesting perspective to be able to see out of that. And the third piece of this that I find really interesting is, as you noted, in an era where it's really difficult to get bipartisan commitment on anything on the Hill, you saw overwhelming support, not just for these resolutions, but for the creation of a specific committee focusing on China, led by Representative Mike Gallagher, looking at this, right? So it is an area of bipartisan agreement, I think, from a domestic political perspective, and it would be interesting to get Josh's take on this as well. There's the potential to push for stronger language, because it is an area of shared interest on both sides of the aisle. And so there's a lot of political pieces to this that I think are very interesting. I think it's also super interesting to see how the Chinese government reacted and what they're going to do from now on. And it's just a very fascinating thing, which isn't also always a good thing. I think there's a Chinese proverb that's quasi a curse about living in interesting times. So it is very interesting. I'll just say that.
Excellent. Others jump in.
Yeah, just Kristen makes a great point, Jim, which is that we've got this rare moment of bipartisan consensus. And I would draw it back to many of the events during the previous administration and some that have happened during this administration, where I think a lot of folks are starting to reevaluate the US-China relationship. And I don't mean that in a sort of existential way, not like, do we have relations with China, but just like, what does it mean to have a relationship with the Chinese Communist Party? Because I think this is a pretty clear example of a very brazen act. And the delay in making any kind of a statement, and then the sort of snipey statements that happened after, just convey that I don't believe, and I found this to be the case, and it's possible others had different experiences, but I don't believe that the Chinese Communist Party believes in a world order that the rest of the world lives in. And so you see them utilizing their position essentially with the attitude of raw power will win the day. They've likely been running these balloons for months to years. They finally got caught. And the question is, like, will they in any way, shape, or form be restrained? And I think the answer is no. There are many cases that we've seen over the past 10 years of them doing similar things. Newsweek articles that just came out recently talking about them spying on very sensitive facilities using commercial companies that they claim don't have any connection to the Chinese Communist Party, but in fact do. And so the point is, we have to start to think about, and I think both houses and on both sides of the aisle, folks are starting to think about, how can the United States have a relationship with entities, both commercial and governmental, connected to the Chinese Communist Party? And I think there's a reckoning coming, whether it's on Huawei or TikTok or any number of other aspects, supply chains. I just think it's really, I think we're at a turning point.
Okay, interesting. John.
President Gash, I really like the phrase that Josh used about how this was a brazen act. And it wasn't a singular brazen act, but it certainly, at least in the surveillance via balloon world, is a pattern of activity, as we've briefed the 40 countries or so that have been victims to this type of violations of their sovereignty. But it's also part of a broader pattern of activity of aggression and malign action by the CCP-controlled China. And whether that's lasing activity against the Philippine Coast Guard, or whether it's an OPM breach or $600 billion of stolen intellectual property a year from China, that this is part of a pattern. And if we're going to successfully deter China from breaching or violating an international world order that, frankly, we established after World War II and has benefited the planet, including China, then we need to demonstrate capability and will to prevent them to the maximum extent possible from similar actions or activities, or those that are worse, that would violate those international norms. And I think that we're at an important pivot point here, as Josh pointed out, with respect to the world waking up to the pattern of this aggressive activity and what we need to do about it so that that activity doesn't spill out into what President Biden suggested today was conflict. We want to compete. We don't want conflict, but they get a vote as well. And we need to do what we can, not just as the United States, but alongside of our allies and partners, to deter via demonstrated capability and will to prevent them from doing those things that would harm an international world order that has been beneficial to many.
Wow. Well, thank you for that elaboration of what's really at risk here. So what we want to do now, and we have this chat box, put in your questions that you have from the audience, and Nicole Taylor, who you met at the very beginning, is going to be kind of moderating the questions, sifting through them and posing them either to the panel at large or to individual panelists. So go ahead and start adding the chat questions. And Nicole, why don't you take the first one? We'll do about 10 minutes or so of questions.
Thank you. And I will just say those in attendance have really appreciated all of the information and the insight. And so thank you all. One of the questions that's come up a number of times is this acknowledgement that decision-making in these kinds of situations is on a very fast timeline. And so could one or all of you speak to this idea of what are the steps that we take to make good decisions on a fast timeline? And are there any things that we can do to extend the timeline such that we can further gather information and potentially make better decisions with extra time? Josh, I know you commented on that. Maybe you can start and others can join in.
Yeah. Thanks, Nicole. It's a great question. I would just say that the thing to do is to have good people in the room, because unfortunately, these events do unfold very quickly. And so that really goes back to the mission of Pepperdine University and what President Gash has been talking about, and even holding these types of meetings. The only other thing that I'd say is I'd direct folks in the audience to a fantastic book called Essence of Decision, which is a historic analysis of the Cuban Missile Crisis and how decision-making happened during those very few days when that happened. And you'll see how, if you read the book, these things really do just happen at the speed of life.
And if I could weigh in here, one of the things that underpins it is a clear process where everybody understands their role and understand everybody else's role, and a process that you run, and that you run tabletop exercises, you run discussion groups, you practice making decisions and understanding where does the information go from. The worst thing you can do in a crisis is know who you're supposed to call or not know who you're supposed to call. And even if you did know, not know how to get a hold of them, or not know where to get information. So process underpins it. And then the other thing I say that's really important to making good decisions under stress or in a crisis is to understand that you're never going to have perfect knowledge. Never. You're going to have to try and get it the best knowledge that you can, and then you're going to have to make a decision. In the intel world, we used to say the perfect is the enemy of the good. You're never going to have perfect. So you're going to go for good, and you're going to make it work. I think George Patton actually probably said it best, which is an okay plan violently executed today is better than a perfect plan next week. I might have messed that one up a little bit, but that's the gist of it.
And maybe just to pile on to those very good thoughts, it's so critical not just to have good people in the room, but the right people that have the ties to the interagency to give you the breadth of the experiences and information in order to make not just a decision that would be good myopically for one agency, but such that you can use the whole of government apparatus to make sure you're as informed as possible for the best decision of an integrated decision across whole of government for our country.
Let me just follow up there. Thank you to all three of you. Kristen, we saw the Department of Homeland Security created, a decade or more ago, seemingly for something like this. So there can be this interagency 2 decades ago. I'm pretty old. Is this the kind of thing that you were talking about in terms of or that John was talking about in terms of the coordination, and does it work like we hoped it would work?
The Department of Homeland Security was born out of the aftermath of 9/11. The department has many wonderful things about it, but it was created out of many existing functions and then added additional authorities and functionality. And creating a smooth internal process or a fully integrated department out of things that have their individual history, processes, and culture is extremely challenging. It's something that the department still grapples with today. However, it's not just the department that's responsible in an event like this because it has military overtones to it. The interagency process is absolutely critical here. And as Josh and John both said, having that process, having that interagency, being able to work collaboratively, that's critical. And that comes from the very top of every department, as well as the culture of the individual departments where everyone is working together. And I'll say I worked in Congress, I worked at the CIA, I worked at DHS, and I've sat in different branches of government at different levels. And the one thing that doesn't change is that anybody who chooses to dedicate their life or even just a portion of their life to serving their country really does believe that it's about making the best decision possible for the people of the United States of America and then for the global community as a whole.
Very helpful. Thank you. Nicole, next question.
Thank you. Well, let's just divert 1 second for a really important social question. Lots of Top Gun fans, John, are wondering what your call sign is. And did you have some sort of event like shooting down a balloon that changed your call sign? If so, what was it?
No, so Nicole, thanks for asking. My call sign is Dragon. I have had it since 1998. It has to do with zero sustained nuclear weapons, and that's all I'm going to say. But you typically get a call sign 6 months or so into your first operational assignment based on something stupid that you did, but it's got to sound kind of cool. And once you get a call sign, you typically don't get another one unless there's something of such a massive magnitude that it would allow you to get hostily renamed to something else.
So you're saying one call sign is enough?
Yes, I'm happy with mine, and I never want another one.
Okay, thank you. Well, on a much more serious note, there are some questions about what this means, all of these things, together with also China's much more stringent control of tech companies, its position with Hong Kong and Taiwan, and other things that it's doing politically, along with these suspected balloons. What is China's end game? What is the long game for China? And how does this action in the US play into that?
Yeah, so Nicole, that's a great question. Let me jump in, and not to be the hawk in the room, but I think China primarily, or at least the CCP, wants to remain in control of China. And then best they can, they want to shift a world order that is more aligned with them and less aligned with the United States. There are a couple of CCP colonels back in 1999 that wrote a doctrine that's known as unrestricted warfare, which essentially means that this is warfare without limits, and you use every possible domain to engage in your adversary. And so I think that we've got to be very sensitive to the fact that, number one, the CCP wants to remain in control, but they also fundamentally want to replace this world order that we established after World War II. And they are doing it bit by bit via unrestricted warfare. Whether we want to compete or not, they see themselves in conflict with us.
I would just chime in on that, which is to say that they're a totalitarian communist dictatorship, and what they understand is that the American system and the global system that has come after World War II is very open, and their accession to the World Trade Organization has afforded them economic liberties that have allowed their economy to grow exponentially. And at the same time, they have completely ignored their WTO obligations, which were obligations from the moment they joined that organization. They flouted them. They flout our SEC regulations. And essentially what they do is they play by two different sets of rules, much like many of their companies have two different sets of accounting books, which is that they get to participate in the free world. And then for companies and even countries that want to engage with China, there's a second set of rules there. And I would just offer the TikTok example, which is that try and log into Facebook or Twitter or YouTube from China, and you're completely prevented. But at the same time, ByteDance, a Chinese company, is allowed to operate numerous social media companies here in the United States. And I just think it goes back to this shift, this moment that we've all talked about, which is that I think the American people, and especially members of Congress, are waking up and recognizing that there needs to be some reciprocity here.
And I would add from a kind of historical cultural perspective, and I say this not as a China expert, but as a reader of many books of history, as much as manifest destiny and kind of pathological optimism underpin the American psyche, there is a sense within Chinese culture and history of the inevitable rise of China and its domination, and they very proudly lean into that.
Let me ask a follow-up question, if I could. Briefly, does this make a conflict with China over Taiwan more likely, less likely, or no impact? Does this impact? Second part of the question, does this impact, in your view, the timing or the fact of whether they will invade Taiwan? Does no change or make it more likely or less likely?
Yeah, so President Gash, our prevailing strategy, certainly in the national defense strategy of last year, but slightly in the national security strategy, is one of integrated deterrence. The idea that we are using whole of government United States capabilities and our allies and partners to deter the Chinese from violating the free, open, secure, and prosperous world order that we enjoy and the rest of the world enjoys. And deterrence, in a lot of ways, is very similar to deterrence that we used during the Cold War. It's a mix of capability and will, and allowing your adversary to perceive what your capability and will is so that they can weigh cost, benefits, and risks to deciding to do something or not to do something. And I don't think that a balloon that violates our sovereignty is going to improve or diminish deterrence, but our response to it does either improve or diminish deterrence. And I think it's important that every time we consider action based on provocation or violations of things like our sovereignty, we have to realize that not only is it setting a precedent in that domain, but it is also weighing into the perceptions of the CCP as far as cost, benefits, and risks with respect to doing something like an invasion of Taiwan. And so I think it's very important for us as we consider responses like this to understand that they are considering our capability and will, and how they perceive it can very well tip the scales towards successful or unsuccessful deterrence.
So just to follow up, more likely, less likely, no change on whether they invade Taiwan.
Yeah, so I think that maybe it's slightly more likely based on some dithering and lack of resolve after the initial spotting of the balloon over Montana. I don't think that it substantially tips the scales, but I do think that there was a period there where we demonstrated a lack of will to respond to a violation of sovereignty that could have tipped the scales if it was allowed to continue and that balloon was never shot down.
Thanks, Josh.
Same point.
Okay. Kristen?
I think John's comments were very thoughtful in many ways. I would say that I think that the larger lessons are probably being learned in how the world responds to Ukraine and what the outcomes are there. That'll have a larger impact on interpreting the signs and the conditions for a possible military action than anything else.
So to follow up on that, am I hearing you right that the fact that the United States and the vast majority of the world responded against Russia's invasion of Ukraine tips the scales in against China doing that because they see the world responding collectively? Am I hearing you right?
I think it's more like impacts it now, but perceptions are constantly evolving. So it'll just depend on the world's resolve in Ukraine in the long run.
Okay, excellent. Nicole, I think we got time for one more question.
Okay, great. I think people are wondering, Kristen, you mentioned in Afghanistan that United States used similar techniques, but with a little more permission than perhaps happened here. Is there something about this incident that propels the United States to similarly engage in surveillance over China? And if we do that or some other kind of surveillance, will the Chinese reaction be similar to what happened here in the United States? Or, as John was mentioning, we may have had some lack of will to respond to the provocation. What would China's projected response be if we were to do something similar?
Well, I think the best kind of surveillance is the kind that doesn't get caught, right? So I think that's the kind of surveillance the United States of America, or frankly, any sovereign nation is probably aiming for.
If we were not so successful in not being caught, what would China's reaction be to something like this, assuming they could identify that it was the United States?
I think in any case, you're going to look at precedent, you're going to look at prevailing political conditions, and you're going to look at what kind of messaging you want to send. And those all will go into determining a response. I don't know if John can comment on to expectations around rules of engagement or what a different country would extrapolate from that. But yeah, those are all, it's such a government response, but it depends.
It's also a lawyer's response. It depends. Josh or John, any follow-up answer to that question?
I think Kristen is spot on. I think they would weigh the situation. They would consider the precedent, but I suspect that they probably would act with some fairly strong resolution to demonstrate their will and capability, because that certainly tends to be their pattern, and it's a pattern that is successful for them and will likely make the statement that they would otherwise want.
Yeah, I would just say that the lesson that I've in some way taken away from this incident also has to do with asymmetry, which is that balloons are inexpensive, they're quick to manufacture, they have an incredible amount of persistence. They're, no offense to the F-22, but almost the opposite of the F-22. And I think that what we're also seeing is that there are asymmetric technologies that can be developed in these global scenarios that I think can play really decisive roles. And we see the Chinese exploring those. And I think it's a call to action for the American defense establishment to really start thinking about, and this is somewhat anathema to the business practices of the past, well, however many years since President Eisenhower's farewell address. But the point is, are there ways in which we can start to develop inexpensive, tactically useful, even strategically useful capabilities that may not cost, $87 million a platform, but may cost, $87,000 a platform.
Very insightful. And John, is it fair to say that you're not offended by having balloons not compared to our F-22 fighter jets?
No, in fact, just the opposite. I appreciate Josh saying that they're diametrically opposite from one another. But he brings up a great point that the cost curve or trade-off between balloon and missile is significant. And so we need to consider how to make sure that the cost curve is in our favor and not drastically against us like it is in this case.
Well, thank you, Nicole, for leading the audience questions. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Kristen and John and Josh, for allowing us to learn from you and for the opportunity to spend this hour becoming better citizens, learning what's happening in our world and thinking about what's coming next as a result of this. For those of you who are watching and want to be able to send this to somebody at home or send the link, this will be linkable on Pepperdine University's site. If you just Google real issues, real experts, real time, sometime in the real soon future, this will be online and you'll have a chance to watch that. We'll continue to do these periodically when real issues arise, and we'll have real experts who will be helping us to understand them. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you to our panelists, and God bless you all. Have a great evening.